What if I told you that Jesus of Nazareth violated every single psychological law we know about human stress response? While modern CEOs collapse under pressure, while world leaders crack during crises, while athletes choke in crucial moments, this carpenter from Galilee maintained impossible calm in situations that should have destroyed any human mind. Tonight, we're diving into the hidden psychological architecture that allowed one man to remain serene while facing betrayal, torture, and death. The science behind his unshakable composure will challenge everything you think you know about human psychological limits and reveal secrets that could transform how you handle your own stress forever. If you're building mental resilience, the most powerful psychological method in history was hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. What Jesus understood about stress will change everything you know about human limits. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about Jesus' psychology. They think his calmness came from some supernatural detachment from human emotion. But that's not what the historical record shows us at all. What we're looking at is a man who experienced the most psychologically devastating betrayal scenario possible. Yet his stress response system seemed to operate on entirely different rules than every other human being we've studied. Picture this. You've spent 3 years building the most intimate circle of trust imaginable. 12 men who've left everything to follow you. You've shared meals, secrets, and dreams with them. You've trusted them with your deepest mission. Then, in your darkest hour, when you need them most, they all abandon you. One sells you out for pocket change. Another denies even knowing you. The rest vanish into the night. According to every psychological model we have, from attachment theory to trauma psychology, this level of betrayal should trigger catastrophic stress responses. We're talking fight or flight activation, cortisol flooding, emotional dysregulation, and psychological collapse. Modern research shows us that betrayal trauma literally rewires the brain, causing lasting damage to our ability to trust and function. Yet the historical accounts describe something impossible. Jesus maintained perfect emotional equilibrium. No rage outbursts, no panic attacks, no psychological breakdown. Even when Peter denied knowing him for the 3rd time, Jesus simply looked at him with what witnesses described as profound sadness. Not the explosive anger or devastation we'd expect. This isn't just unusual, it's scientifically baffling. Every stress psychology textbook tells us that humans have physiological limits. Push us beyond them and our systems will crash. But Jesus seemed to operate outside these fundamental laws of human psychology, as if he'd discovered some hidden operating system that the rest of us don't have access to. How is this even possible? Here's the psychological secret that changes everything. Jesus had developed what modern neuroscience calls metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. But he took it to a level that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. The key lies in something psychologists call cognitive reappraisal, the ability to reframe stressful situations in ways that reduce their emotional impact. But Jesus didn't just reappraise situations. He seems to have operated from a completely different framework of reality that rendered traditional stress triggers powerless. When Judas approached him in the garden with the soldiers, Jesus addressed him as friend. This isn't just remarkable kindness, it's psychological mastery. He'd already processed the betrayal, accepted it as part of a larger purpose, and stripped it of its power to create stress in his system. Modern neuroscience tells us this requires extraordinary prefrontal cortex regulation, the ability to override the amygdala's fear response through conscious choice. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jesus demonstrated what psychologists now call post-traumatic growth in real time. While most people experience trauma as something that happens to them, Jesus seemed to experience it as something that was happening through him for a greater purpose. This reframe is so powerful that it literally changes how your nervous system processes the experience. Research from Stanford and Harvard shows us that people who can find meaning in their suffering experience dramatically lower stress hormones, better immune function, and greater emotional resilience. But Jesus took this to an extreme level. He found meaning so profound that it completely transformed the nature of the experience itself. The betrayal wasn't happening to him. It was happening for humanity. The abandonment wasn't personal rejection. It was necessary for a greater mission. This level of cognitive reframing requires what psychologists call perspective-taking abilities that most humans struggle to maintain even in minor conflicts, let alone life-threatening crises. What's most remarkable is that this wasn't just philosophical, it was neurobiological. His stress response system was literally operating on different software. Instead of "how do I survive this?" his brain was running, "how does this serve the bigger picture?" That single cognitive shift changes everything about how your nervous system responds to threat. Think of your stress response like a smoke detector in your brain. For most of us, when betrayal happens, that detector starts screaming, "Danger! Trust is broken! Survival threatened!" But Jesus had somehow rewired his detector to a completely different alarm system. Imagine if instead of a smoke detector, you had a master architect's blueprint reader in your head. When smoke appears, instead of panic, you think, this fire is exactly where the blueprint said it would be. This isn't destroying the building, this is clearing space for the renovation. That's exactly what Jesus did psychologically, while his disciples' brains were screaming, "Betrayal detected. Abort mission." His mind was calmly reading from a different blueprint entirely. This is precisely where the plan called for temporary darkness before permanent light. Modern psychologists call this benefit finding, the ability to extract positive meaning from negative experiences. But most of us can only do this in retrospect, sometimes years later. Jesus was doing it in real time, in the moment of maximum psychological pressure. This cognitive superpower allowed him to bypass the entire stress cascade that cripples most humans. No fight or flight, no cortisol flood, no emotional dysregulation. His nervous system literally couldn't interpret the situation as threatening because his interpretation software was running on different code. The most powerful part? This wasn't passive acceptance or emotional numbing. This was active transformation, taking the raw material of betrayal and consciously choosing to see it as necessary preparation for something greater. It's like having the ability to watch a horror movie and see the beautiful cinematography instead of feeling scared. This is the first secret of impossible calm. When you change the story, you tell yourself about what's happening. You literally change what's happening in your nervous system. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. Because what comes next will shatter your understanding of human psychological limits, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Now let's examine something even more psychologically impossible, Jesus' behavior during his execution. This is where every model of human psychology completely breaks down, because what we're witnessing violates the most basic laws of pain psychology and trauma response. Here's what should have happened according to everything we know about human psychology. When facing torture and death, humans experience what's called psychological crisis response. Your survival systems take complete control. Rational thinking shuts down. Emotional regulation collapses. You either fight desperately, flee frantically, or freeze completely. The crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was designed to be the most psychologically devastating death possible. Roman crucifixion was engineered to maximize psychological terror. The victim was stripped naked to destroy dignity, crucified publicly to maximize shame, left to die slowly to extend the psychological torture for hours or even days. Every aspect was calculated to break the human spirit before it broke the body. The Romans had studied what destroys human psychological resilience, and they built it all into this execution method. It wasn't just about killing, it was about psychological obliteration. But here's where Jesus' behavior becomes scientifically inexplicable. Instead of psychological collapse, he displayed what can only be described as supernatural composure. While hanging from nails, experiencing what medical experts describe as one of the most painful deaths imaginable, he was having conversations, thinking clearly, making provisions for his mother's care, offering forgiveness to his executioners. This isn't just remarkable, it's medically impossible according to everything we know about pain psychology. When humans experience extreme physical trauma, the brain floods with stress hormones that make coherent thinking nearly impossible. Pain that severe should trigger overwhelming fight-or-flight responses that shut down higher cognitive functions completely. Yet witnesses describe Jesus speaking with perfect clarity, maintaining emotional control, and even showing concern for others while his own body was being destroyed. Modern emergency medicine tells us this level of composure during extreme trauma is beyond human physiological capacity. The secret lies in something psychologists call dissociation, but not the pathological kind that trauma victims experience. Jesus seemed to have mastered what we might call conscious dissociation, the ability to separate his identity from his immediate physical experience without losing touch with reality. Modern neuroscience research shows us that advanced meditation practitioners can literally change how their brains process pain. Brain scans of Buddhist monks during painful stimuli show dramatically reduced activity in pain-processing regions while maintaining full awareness. But Jesus took this to levels that even advanced practitioners struggle to achieve. The key was his profound sense of identity separation. While his body was experiencing torture, his sense of self remained anchored to something beyond physical experience. Psychological research calls this self-transcendence, the ability to maintain identity and purpose even when your immediate circumstances are overwhelming. But here's the really fascinating part. Jesus wasn't just managing pain, he was actively using the experience to serve others. While dying, he was counseling the criminal next to him, comforting his mother, and even praying for his executioner's forgiveness. This requires what psychologists call other-focused coping, using your own crisis as an opportunity to help others. Research from UCLA and other institutions shows that other-focused coping actually reduces stress hormones and pain perception more effectively than self-focused coping strategies. When you're actively serving others during your own crisis, your brain literally processes the experience differently. But doing this while being tortured to death requires psychological mastery that's almost incomprehensible. The crucifixion reveals Jesus' most advanced psychological skill, the ability to maintain not just composure, but active compassion and clear thinking while experiencing maximum physical and emotional assault. This suggests he had developed what modern psychology calls stress inoculation, to levels that exceed anything we've documented in human performance research. What's most remarkable is that this wasn't just endurance, it was transformation. He was actively converting the experience of being victimized into an act of service. Instead of "this is happening to me," his mindset was "this is happening through me for others." This level of cognitive reframe during extreme trauma represents psychological capabilities that challenge our understanding of human mental limits. Imagine your consciousness like a lighthouse during a hurricane. Most people's awareness is like a small boat. When the storm hits, they're completely at the mercy of the waves, tossed around helplessly, fighting just to survive. But a lighthouse? The storm rages around it, waves crash against it, winds tear at it. But the light itself never wavers. It stays focused on its purpose, guiding others to safety. The lighthouse doesn't ignore the storm or pretend it's not happening. It experiences every bit of the hurricane's fury, but its core identity and function remain completely stable. That's exactly what Jesus did psychologically during the crucifixion. His body was the lighthouse structure being battered by the ultimate storm. But his consciousness, his awareness, his purpose, his compassion remained like that steady light, completely focused on serving others even while the hurricane of torture raged around him. Modern pain psychology tells us that suffering has two components: the physical sensation and the psychological story we tell ourselves about it. Most of us experience both at full intensity, but Jesus had mastered the ability to separate these completely. His body felt every nail, every torn muscle, every labored breath, but his mind was operating from a different narrative entirely. This pain is purchasing freedom for others. This suffering is opening doors for humanity. This death is actually life for millions. This is the second secret of impossible calm. When you anchor your identity to something larger than your immediate circumstances, you become psychologically unshakable. Your body can be under assault, but your core self remains serene because it's connected to something the assault cannot touch. The lighthouse doesn't avoid the storm. It transforms the storm into an opportunity to fulfill its highest purpose. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit like now and subscribe. Because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in my next videos. Here's the ultimate psychological puzzle that changes everything. Jesus' behavior immediately after his alleged resurrection. This is where we encounter the most psychologically complex evidence of all. Because if we take the historical accounts seriously, we're looking at someone who experienced the ultimate trauma, death itself, and then returned with psychological capabilities that transcend everything we understand about human consciousness. Think about this from a purely psychological perspective. If someone experienced clinical death, the complete shutdown of all brain function, and then somehow returned, what would we expect their mental state to be? Modern neuroscience tells us that even brief interruptions to brain oxygen cause lasting cognitive damage, memory loss, and personality changes. But the post-resurrection accounts describe something that challenges every model of brain science. Jesus returned with not just intact cognitive function, but enhanced psychological abilities. Perfect emotional regulation, complete memory preservation, expanded empathy, and most remarkably, no signs of trauma processing from the crucifixion experience. This isn't just medically unusual. It's psychologically impossible according to everything we know about how consciousness relates to brain function. Someone who experienced torture, death, and resurrection should show massive psychological after effects, PTSD, memory fragmentation, emotional dysregulation, identity confusion. Instead, the accounts describe someone with supernatural psychological integration. He appears to his disciples not as a traumatized survivor, but as someone who has achieved perfect psychological mastery. He's calm, purposeful, compassionate, and completely focused on others' needs rather than processing his own experience. But here's the most psychologically intriguing element. Jesus seems to understand something about the nature of consciousness itself that allowed him to transcend the normal relationship between mind and physical experience. The resurrection accounts suggest he had discovered how to maintain continuous conscious identity even through the dissolution of physical brain function. Whether you interpret this literally or metaphorically, we're looking at someone who developed psychological capabilities that represent the ultimate evolution of human consciousness, the ability to maintain perfect mental integration even through experiences that should completely shatter psychological functioning. The ultimate secret of Jesus' impossible psychological mastery comes down to one revolutionary insight. He had completely transcended the illusion of separation between his individual consciousness and universal consciousness. This isn't just spiritual philosophy, it's advanced psychology that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Research in consciousness studies shows us that our sense of individual self is actually a construction of the brain. What neuroscientists call the default mode network. This network creates our sense of being a separate individual having experiences. But advanced practitioners of consciousness disciplines can temporarily dissolve this sense of separation, accessing what they describe as unity consciousness. Jesus appears to have permanently stabilized in this state. Instead of experiencing life as Jesus having experiences, he experienced life as universal consciousness, expressing through the Jesus form. This single shift in identity changes everything about how you relate to what happens to you. When your identity is separate and individual, threats to your body, reputation, or relationships feel like threats to your very existence. Your stress response system treats every challenge as a survival crisis. But when your identity is universal, individual circumstances become simply temporary expressions of a much larger, indestructible reality. This is why betrayal couldn't break him. Betrayal was happening to the temporary Jesus form, not to his true identity. This is why torture couldn't overwhelm him. Torture was affecting the physical vehicle, not his essential self. This is why death couldn't destroy him. Death could only release him from temporary limitation. Modern research in what psychologists call self-transcendent experiences shows that people who access these states report profound psychological resilience, decreased fear of death, and dramatically reduced stress responses. But these are usually temporary experiences that fade as normal consciousness returns. Jesus seems to have made this expanded identity his permanent operating system. Every challenge, from betrayal to crucifixion, was processed through the perspective of universal consciousness rather than individual survival. This allowed him to respond to every situation with perfect love, wisdom, and composure because he wasn't defending a separate self that could be threatened. The resurrection represents the ultimate demonstration of this principle. Even the dissolution of physical form couldn't interrupt his continuous conscious identity because his true self was never dependent on physical form to begin with. Imagine consciousness like the ocean. Most of us experience ourselves as individual waves, separate, temporary, fighting to maintain our particular shape against other waves and changing tides. When storms come, waves crash and disappear, and each wave experiences this as personal death and destruction. But what if a wave suddenly realized it was never actually separate from the ocean? What if it discovered that its true identity wasn't wave, but ocean expressing as wave? Suddenly everything changes. Other waves can't threaten it because it is them. Storms can't destroy it because it is the storm. Even when the waveform dissolves, nothing real is lost because the ocean remains. The wave realizes it was never the temporary form. It was always the eternal substance. That's exactly what Jesus discovered about consciousness. While most humans experience themselves as separate individuals who can be threatened, betrayed, or destroyed, Jesus realized his true identity as universal consciousness temporarily expressing through human form. This is why nothing could shake his psychological composure. Betrayal, that's just consciousness playing different roles. Torture, that's just temporary experience happening within consciousness. Death, that's just the ocean reabsorbing one of its waves. But here's the revolutionary part. He taught that this same realization is available to everyone. Every human wave can discover they're actually the ocean. Every individual consciousness can recognize their expressions of universal consciousness. This is the third and ultimate secret of impossible calm. When you realize your true identity transcends your temporary circumstances, you become psychologically invincible. Not because nothing bad can happen to your form, but because your real self is the indestructible awareness within which all forms appear and disappear. The ocean cannot be threatened by its waves. Universal consciousness cannot be harmed by individual experiences. Once you know what you really are, impossible calm becomes your natural state. Here's what connects all three psychological secrets Jesus mastered. He discovered how to operate from identity rather than circumstance, purpose rather than survival, and universal consciousness rather than individual limitation. These aren't just spiritual concepts. They're advanced psychological technologies that completely rewrite how your nervous system responds to stress. The betrayal secret teaches identity transcendence. The crucifixion secret reveals conscious dissociation mastery. The resurrection secret demonstrates consciousness beyond form. Together they show us that impossible calm isn't impossible at all. It's the natural result of remembering what you really are beneath temporary circumstances. Jesus didn't just teach love, he modeled the psychology of transcendence. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on these ideas? Leave comments below. Send this to that friend with sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on historical accounts and public information, not clinical diagnosis. The psychological interpretations presented are theoretical frameworks for understanding reported behaviors and should not be considered definitive psychological or medical conclusions.